Welcome back and many thanks for staying with us right here in NTV Uganda. There is a call from all stakeholders within the East African region for all member states to clamor towards the harmonization of a fiscal regime. Yes, a unified fiscal regime in the EAC region, but we are far from that reality. Why? We do have Grace Namugambe, the program officer at the Southern and Eastern Africa Trade Information and Negotiations Institute, better known as CEATINI. She joins me right now to expand more on these very, very pertinent issues. We've been having or reading the same budgets within the East African region, especially since 2016. So for the last 5 years, we read the budget during the same period, which is June. But then if you look at the domestic revenue measures that are implemented in Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, yes, and Rwanda, you realize that they are so different. And according to the experts, they contend that these tax measures are so regressive on the people, the citizens from which these tax measures have been implemented. If you look at the tax regime of Uganda, out of the 44.7 trillion shilling budget that we have actually announced, we do know that 20.8 trillion that is going to finance that 44.7 trillion budget is going to come from taxes. Isn't that regressive in nature? How many Ugandans can afford that under the negative social impacts, social and economic impacts of the COVID-19 disease? How many people can actually cope all that? We also do know that so many people are grappling in that regard. Small and medium-sized enterprises are not working anymore. So how shall they be able to do their part, which is actually pay the taxes? So aren't they regressive in nature? Even if you go to Tanzania, if you go to Rwanda, all those domestic revenue measures are actually regressive in nature. And also they are not hitting the targets simply because they are giving tax havens to the investors. Yes, investors are coming here and are being given tax havens, yet they are individuals from whom we could have squeezed all those taxes. And then we are now squeezing taxes from individuals, citizens who are actually not making any money, especially with the onset of the COVID-19 disease. I have Grace Namugambe. She is the program officer for the Southern and Eastern Africa Trade Information and Negotiations Institute, better known as CEATINI. She's here with me in the studio. Grace, good morning. First off, in terms of tax harmonization, of course, where do we stand as a community?
For the East African community, right now, as I speak, we're not really doing well when it comes to tax harmonization, despite the fact that these are commitments that countries made way back from as early as 1997 and even before then.
In respect to social distancing, I believe the viewer would like to see that pretty face and to hear your voice. You can remove it, the mask.
Oh, sorry.
All right, that is Grace Namugambe, Program Officer at the Southern and Eastern Africa Trade Information and Negotiations Institute. We are expanding more on the race by the East African region towards a harmonized fiscal regime within the EAC region. Why are we still chasing this? Yet it is so important. The Customs Union Protocol calls for it. The Monetary Union Protocol calls for that. But then the EAC members are actually relenting. Why? Grace Namugambe, where do we stand as a community? What have we agreed on as member states? And what are we failing to agree on?
Like I said before, we countries in the East African region, we are at a point where we've failed to agree when it comes to harmonization of taxes.
Indeed.
And that is so despite the fact that this is something that we've been talking about for quite a number of years. But we still see quite a number of discrepancies, quite a lot of issues coming up when it comes to us agreeing on a common position in terms of harmonization of taxes. We see that countries have taken steps. For instance, there's been an EAC model treaty that has been developed, and that is basically to guide double taxation in the region. We have the EAC mining bill, which to some extent allows for provision of taxation when it comes to the mining sector. And we also have the East Africa Community Customs Management Act, and that is basically looking at issues to do with goods that are coming in or going out of the East African region. And I think we've made quite a lot of progress when it comes to customs taxes because we see similar rates. However, when it comes to income taxes, when it comes to excise duties, there's quite a bit of a challenge, because we see countries now taking a deeper interest in their own, in protecting their own commodities. For instance, Uganda might impose higher taxes on goods that might be coming in from Kenya, or Kenya imposing higher taxes on goods that will be coming in from Uganda. And that does not really speak to tax harmonization. But also looking at issues to do with tax incentives, where we see countries within the EAC continuously trying to award tax incentives, because they are all trying to work towards attracting foreign direct investment. So we see countries continuously awarding longer tax holidays, providing lower tax rates in terms of income tax, and that has led to what we term as a race to the bottom.
Indeed.
Because then you see countries are all trying to have the least rates under the hope that they will attract more investors, and at the end of the day we lose out as countries in the EAC.
Tax to GDP ratio, which is supposed to be at 25%, am I right?
Yeah,
but
that
none of
is,
the East African countries are above 20.
None of them. So you see a constantly lower tax to GDP ratio, but not just the tax to GDP ratio, failure of the countries to hit their targets. And I think...
Is it largely because we are giving tax havens to these investors? Is it only because of that?
Tax incentives.
Yes, is it only because of that?
It's not only because of that. We also have quite a number of loopholes within our tax laws.
What are those?
That have often, those have often been used or exploited by people who are, I would say, masterminds or experts at the tax law, and they've been using those to avoid and sometimes evade payment of their fair share of taxes. So there are quite a number of issues that have contributed to that. You also look at issues to do with, of course, revenue administrations failing to capture quite a number of people into the tax brackets, the large informal sector, but also issues to do with corruption. And maybe when it comes to tax incentives, there are reports that have revealed that as countries within the EAC, we've lost about 1.5 billion, or we lose about 1.5 billion to 2 billion US dollars every year to these incentives. And we see that because of all that, we then have to get into a cycle where countries are relying more on debt. And of course, in order to pay up for the debt, you have to impose rather regressive tax measures. So it's a vicious cycle.
Is the analogy coming in from the tax experts from these EAC member countries that if they tax these investors, they'll scare them away? Is it justified that if you tax the investors badly, they run away, they'll shy away from coming to your country?
I think
it's like we are attracting crooks to our countries who know, okay, in Uganda if I go, they won't charge me that much, I'll milk everything and then send it back home. So they come, invest, but they still repatriate most of the money and take it back home.
Yeah. And I think for me, but also from research that has come out previously, we don't necessarily need to have tax incentives in place. We need to have a stable macroeconomy. We need to have a stable or a calm political climate. We need to have good infrastructure, and all these are things that would ideally attract investors beyond having tax incentives, because we see that a number of those who are actually benefiting from these tax incentives, for instance, I'll give an example of tax holidays. If someone gets a tax holiday of say 10 years, usually they'll come, invest. After the 10 years are done, they'll either change the name of the company, or they will pack up and leave, because I mean they've made as much money as they could, and we as a country are not benefiting. And even then, government is not actually taking steps to assess how much are we benefiting when we award these incentives. Much as people are getting jobs, are they getting quality jobs? And that is something that needs to be ascertained at the end of the day. And government will often argue that we are getting pay as you earn from some of these people who are employed. But when you look at the pay that some of these companies are paying or giving to the employees, it's actually very low. Sometimes way below the threshold or the payee threshold. So they don't even benefit at that point. So I think it's for us or for government to come up with clear guidelines in terms of how they award tax incentives and exemptions, but also to assess the benefits that we are accruing when they award some of these incentives.
Because we are attracting crooks in that regard. So let's take a look at the domestic revenue measures, the regressive domestic measures. Why have they been put together in that way? The fact that you do have a 44.7 trillion budget, but out of that we are expecting 20.8 trillion shillings to come from taxes. You have a tax on the internet, you have tax on real estate, domestic revenue measures that are regressive. Speak on that. Why is it prevalent in many of the EAC countries, not only Uganda, whose tax to GDP ratio is 12.8%?
I think like I said before, that as countries we've tended to race more towards the bottom. And because we are awarding incentives to those who we think are benefiting our country more, we tend to lose out, especially on I would not call it low-hanging fruit, but we tend to lose out on those highly potential revenue sources, because the people who are benefiting from these incentives are mostly the rich, and those are the people who would actually be obliged to pay more taxes. So we're seeing a situation where you and I, the ordinary Ugandans, have to incur a higher burden of tax, being charged tax on quite a number of numerous sources. And I think that is why we then see government trying to impose taxes even on things that would not ideally attract taxes. If government is saying under a particular budget theme that they're trying to work or increase productivity, working towards industrialization, there's no reason as to why government would actually impose a tax on internet, because internet is what we need in this day and age to encourage industrialization. There is a growing digital economy that we need to benefit from as Ugandans. So,
meaning their tax regime is based on quantity, not monetary value.
I would not say
the number of people who are going to clamor for the internet. So let's tax that part.
Yes, but they've not looked deeper into it to see that this is something that is needed for trade. This is something that is needed for education, because we're in a digital era. And the alternative would have been to tax the companies that are facilitating the digital trade, the companies that are actually sourcing income from the trade or from people using their platforms. So I think it would be more ideal for government to tax those companies as opposed to taxing Ugandans. The challenge, though, is that it still won't be able to tax the companies, because very few people are now using them or using some of these platforms, given the limited, given the revenue, given the tax that is imposed on the use of internet. So if few people are using them, then that means at a certain point government cannot come up and block these companies from operating under the premise that very many Ugandans are using them and they are not paying taxes. So it would be good for government to allow what has often been referred to as onboarding, where you have more people using these platforms, and then that would give you an upper hand to actually tax or impose a tax on some of these companies. All
right, Grace Namugambe, we also do know that Article 7, Section 1A of the Treaty for the Establishment of the EAC, the East African Community, underscores the need for people-centered and market-driven cooperation, and also participation on of stakeholders on a wide basis. But then what we are seeing is far removed from reality. Yes, we have seen East African countries slap or impose tariffs on each other's products. Isn't that too far from the reality we are seeing? Isn't it too optimistic to think we can have tax harmonization, yet we are slapping taxes on each other?
And I think that's
Article 7.
That sort of also speaks to what I had talked about earlier, in terms of we see countries increasingly slapping higher duties on goods from member states. We've seen, of course, trade wars between countries in the EAC, and all this is not really speaking to harmonization. So I think it's broadly for us as East African countries to come to a common ground, to agree on how we can actually make tax harmonization work. Because while we're slapping higher taxes or higher tax rates on each other's goods, we are affecting or negatively impacting the common market protocol. And
also the monetary union protocol.
Yeah, and that is not good for us as countries, but also it's not good for the livelihoods of the people within the EAC.
We also do know that, at least from 2016, Grace Namugambe, we've been reading the same budgets at the same time, around June. But then they are always varied when it comes to policy. So what we want to know is, have we stopped coordinating at a policy level as East African countries?
I think we do.
You understand what I mean, Grace Namugambe? Every June we read the same budget.
Yes,
they come up with a very good theme that is uniform.
Yes.
Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania.
Yes.
The theme is usually the same. But if you look at the tax measures and everything, the policies embedded within the domestic budgets themselves, very, very varied. Why?
Like I had said earlier, that we have a tendency of having a very common theme among us as the EAC countries. So sometimes when it comes to issues to do with budgeting, priorities, some of the priorities are often the same, though often differ. But we also see that in terms of allocations might not necessarily speak to the budget theme. But looking now at some of the measures that are put in place when it comes to the tax measures that are put in place during the different financial years, or the amendments that are put in place, they tend to differ. And I'll give an example. In the year 2018 or 2017, Uganda provided for incentives and set out a criteria that should be met. And among those, it stated that citizens within the EAC would benefit or would be considered as citizens of Uganda. But that is not the case, because when you go elsewhere and you're a Ugandan and you're trying to benefit from the incentives regime, they'll look at you as a foreigner, which is not right. So I think those are some of the issues that need to be checked.
All right, Grace Namugambe, let's talk about aggregate fiscal indiscipline. Aggregate fiscal indiscipline has also been touted as one of the reasons why we've actually regressed from hitting the targets when it comes to development. According to the Auditor General, they contend that between the financial year 2015-2016, where we did lose some 31 billion Uganda shillings, they're saying it's because of accounting delays, contrary to the Public Finance and Accounting Regulations of 2016. And also, if you can realize, in 2019-2020, we did unaccounted for funds were around 6 billion. So there was a reduction. But let's talk about aggregate fiscal indiscipline and the fact that delaying accountability is the reason why some people can actually... Yes.
I think when it comes to delaying accountability, it also goes back to issues of transparency. To what extent are citizens being engaged in some of these processes? For instance, because we know that some expenditures or some of the allocations are kept private to government, to individuals or departments in there. But how do we see to it that citizens are able to monitor some of these resources? Because if citizens are not aware of how some of this money has been allocated, then accountability becomes a challenge. When accountability is not, or when the processes of accountability are not working efficiently, then that means that as a country, or the people in charge of some of those resources would tend to divert them to what had not been planned for before, or what might not be much of a priority for us as a country. So of course then we also see issues of corruption coming up, and generally that really costs us as countries within the EAC, but also as Uganda.
What will it take for us as EAC member countries to realize a harmonized fiscal regime moving forward? Grace Namgambi. Let's talk about recommendations of what we need to be doing as EAC countries to ensure a harmonized fiscal regime.
As EAC countries, one, we need to take we need to have a common position on when it comes to tax incentives, exemptions, but we also need to work towards harmonizing our corporate income tax rates. We also need to have our EAC model treaty ratified and working within all the EAC countries, but also for us to continuously work and beyond having beyond having a harmonized budget theme, we need to see to it that the tax measures being put in place and that the tax measures being put in place are actually working towards a harmonized tax regime.
Grace Namugambe is the program officer at the Southern and Eastern Africa, Trade Information and Negotiations Institute, better known as CEATINI. The conversation shall be expanded more from 10 a.m. all the way to 1 p.m. They won't be alone. They shall also be joined by the Civil Society Budget Advocacy Group, also the Ministry of Planning, Economic Development, and also another stakeholder will be actually joining them courtesy of that conversation, racing towards harmonization of a fiscal regime in the EAC region. Let's take a breather, return shortly.